Welcome to the Catholic Midlife podcast, where we're addressing the challenges and the opportunities of midlife from a uniquely Catholic perspective. Join us each week as we spark a midlife renewal and create a firm foundation for the next wonderful, exciting, awesome season of life.
Hello, and welcome to the Catholic Midlife podcast. It's great to be here with you. I'm Curtis. I'm here with Karen.
Hey, everybody.
Karen, we have a comment from a listener. This is on a Facebook post that mentioned forgiveness and reconciliation. And her comment is, in our times, I think we have a tendency to forgive the offender and try to restore the relationship with him as if he has no voice and no agency. If he is unrepentant, we ignore that. It's not about him and his soul. It's about me and my soul. And I will forgive him no matter what he wants or thinks. Somehow, this does not seem like the right approach.
Interesting. So what did you get out of that, Curtis?
Well, what a great comment. And we talked about some of the differences between forgiveness and reconciliation. And where there's no repentance, are we really going to call that forgiveness? We might be better off calling it whatever it is in that situation, releasing emotion, moving on, or what have you.
Exactly. Well, thanks to our listener for making that comment. Today is our final episode in our forgiveness season.
Yeah, you look happy.
Well, I've really enjoyed this. Actually, it went really fast for me, and I've gotten a lot personally out of the forgiveness season. We did, Curtis, want to sort of say a few more things about apologies in light of our previous episode, just because, it's great to have a formula for apologizing, and then there's real life when you're trying to apply it in an actual situation.
Then there's real life. I always kind of resented the "what would Jesus do" movement, because I would think, well, Jesus never went off and did a bunch of really stupid things and put himself in an impossible situation. So how am I supposed to answer that question? Because this wouldn't happen to him.
It's an impossible question. That's just more frustrating.
So the apologies can be part of a more complex situation for sure.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the complexities that we see or that come up for us. One of them that I'd like to mention is, I'm just curious if any of our listeners thought about the 4-step apology from our last episode, right? So that was taking responsibility, owning the harm, showing remorse and sorrow for the harm, making restitution as possible, and making a resolution to change and not to do that behavior again. And I'm just curious if anybody thought that maybe something was missing from that formula.
Here's a clue. We were just talking about it earlier.
We were. So, what about forgiveness? Why isn't asking forgiveness part of apologizing? I think in many families and communities, it's part of the process.
Yeah, I remember educating our kids at a young age to apologize and then tell the other one, and they apologize, and what do you say? I forgive you.
Yeah, I especially remember that happening when we were visiting one of our parents, and they could not contain themselves. They thought that was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, and I think they laughed for half an hour about that. And there we were, trying to educate them on forgiveness. So why aren't we putting that in our formula?
Well, certainly when I'm making an apology, I can't help but hope that I'm going to get forgiveness. I mean, there's no gratification better than instant gratification. But the apology, it's not about me. It's about the other person. It's about the harm they suffered, right?
Sure. So it can take the focus off the other person and make it about them giving you forgiveness.
And that really puts a lot of pressure on them to forgive me right there in the moment.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, because on the one hand, if somebody's got a lot of emotion around something, or they're in kind of a stress response, it's just really hard to forgive from that place. You just need some time to work through it, even if you end up thinking that you overreacted or what have you. It's just respectful to give people space to get to a place of forgiveness. And when you're talking about some really big things, it is essential to give the offended party what they need to get to their own place of forgiveness.
Yeah, forgiveness may be a choice, but it also involves a movement of the heart. And the heart can be encouraged and formed, but it really can't be commanded at the end of the day. So that person needs some time to work it through and see where they get. Or maybe they're not ready to forgive. Maybe there's some larger issues that have to be addressed in, our real complex lives.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's probably not helpful to say, well, I forgive you, if I'm not really forgiving you. I bet we do that a lot too. And we just try to gloss over the fact that we haven't really gotten to that place.
Right. And we're missing our chance to maybe go a little deeper or to have the reconciliation.
Sure. So what do you say then if you don't say, I forgive you, when someone apologizes?
Just thank them for their apology. Thank you for the apology. I really appreciate that.
I appreciate the apology. Thank you for apologizing. It sounds like not enough, and I think it is enough. And sometimes the opposite happens, I think, which is we start to get uncomfortable and we don't want to acknowledge the apology. So instead of saying, thank you for the apology, I appreciate it, we might say like, it's no big deal, or don't worry about it, or something dismissive like that, versus acknowledging the apology and then actually receiving it. It seems to me that's pretty important, don't you think?
Yeah, you want to show some respect for the apology and not dismiss it. It's kind of a gift to you, right? Karen, I mentioned that apology might be part of a more complex situation. For instance, there could be an ongoing pattern of conflict where, the two people have a back and forth, and now this new thing happens and the apology seems to feed into the pattern. So that's pretty abstract. You want an example?
Yes, please.
I'm not sure it made sense. So we gave the example of leaving out the chili. Do you remember that, honey?
I do.
So that was in the last episode. So somebody left out the chili, and Karen, was leaving overnight and said, hey, you have one thing to do, put away the chili before bedtime after it cools off. But she came back the next day. It hadn't been done. She was disappointed and felt unsupported. And so we had a conversation, and Curtis tried some good and not so good apologies. Now, here's a different situation. Say it's the same facts, if you will, but instead of Karen kind of nicely explaining what her problem was with leaving the chili out, what if she had blown up and started yelling, you ignore my needs. You don't help around here. You never do anything. And the one time I ask you to do anything for me, you're not there to support me. You're not there to help me. I'm alone in this marriage. It just completely nukes.
That actually sounds a little cathartic now that I'm listening to you do that. I wonder if I should do that a little more often.
You've never tried it, honey.
I've never tried it.
You should practice with your girlfriends.
See what kind of feedback I get, maybe.
Yeah. So if Karen had come home and walked in the door and just went off on me like that, well, what's going to happen next?
Sure. Well, it seems like one of us would have to offer the apology just to kind of get the process going. I mean, obviously, it sounds like there's some underlying things that the leaving out the chili means to me in the whole
Right.
context.
Right. And that's the point of the example, is that Curtis and Karen have some kind of larger conflict.
Yeah.
Karen's not happy with Curtis's contributions around the house. It's a chronic sore point. And she is bringing all that into this leaving out the chili situation, including all her many emotional harms. And she's even attacking his character, saying that he's leaving her alone in the marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. So this sounds to me like a situation where, it's not just about the apology, it's about the place of the apology in getting to have the deeper conversation about the pattern.
Right.
Is that right?
Because you might be Karen and you wonder, well, now if I apologize for my outburst, do I have to take all those things off the table? I mean,
Yeah.
It's not true that Curtis does nothing around the house, but maybe it's true that the distribution of who does what needs to be, redistributed.
Yeah. So it makes sense that I could offer a very direct apology like, Curtis, I apologize for yelling at you. That was uncalled for. And I especially did not need to bring in all of these other things that I mentioned that had nothing to do with the chili. Please accept my apology. I won't be yelling at you again.
Well, Karen, you attacked my character. How about that?
I am so sorry that I did that. It's not true. And that was inappropriate of me to do that. Please accept my apology.
Okay, I accept your apology. Now, you listeners, can you see how this is setting the stage? The conversation can move on. Curtis might apologize for his part, or she could, at that time, or maybe a little later, come back and ask for a separate conversation about, well, why does she feel unsupported? And maybe the two of them could start do some problem solving or some sharing.
Right. Apologies don't have to be the end of the conversation. Very often they're the beginning of a new kind of conversation. They open up a better kind of communication. And when people feel like they've been validated in feeling harmed, it goes a really long way to being able to have those deeper conversations.
Yeah, the validation. We should try to get another example in. Now, before we do that, Karen, so say that so you gave me a really nice, succinct apology, and you even clarified it when I requested, well, what about this?
Yeah.
You said, yeah, that too. Now, what if you gave one of those non-apologies where, it sort of sounds like an apology, but there's a few disclaimers, a few if-then else's in there?
Sure. More something like, I'm sorry that I yelled at you. I'm sorry I wagged my finger at you, which is a huge trigger. And I know that.
Yeah.
And I did not acknowledge what you do to support me. But the truth is, you really don't prioritize helping me. And I really do feel like the hired help. You could do a lot more around here.
Ooh.
That would be, I'm sorry, but.
You were doing so good.
I know. And then I just exploded the whole thing.
But
Isn't
then
it
all
funny?
of a sudden, I'm feeling really defensive. Boy, and if I have an axe to grind, that's probably going to bring it right back out,
I'm noticing there's a lot of ways to destroy a good apology.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, you said you had a second example.
Yeah, so say that, and this is an example, again, about there are bigger issues, and the apology needs to find the right context. It needs to fit in. So say that your young adult child is visiting you, and all of a sudden something's going on. You're in the kitchen, and she says, Mom, really, I still can't believe how you played favorites with the other kids growing up.
Ouch.
And, like you bought the other kids nice cars, but I got this lame Volkswagen. And I've got these grandkids now, your grandkids, you never offer to come help them frankly, Mom, you're just emotionally distant with them, just like you were with me growing up. That was really
Ooh,
hard.
painful.
So here's this young adult child is just unloading
Yeah.
on Mom.
Yeah.
Ooh, what to do?
Well, it's really, really hard not to get defensive, I think, in a moment like that. So I'm guessing that if you're being unloaded on, that would be your first priority, is to manage the defensiveness in order to respond well.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a strong instinct.
Mm-hmm. And the other hand is that's a pretty great moment. I mean, a lot of young adults would never bring up all that stuff. They just kind of ruminate on it and have the resentment. So it seems like it's really a great opportunity in the relationship. It could go a lot of great places.
When you're hearing the pain, it could be a great time to gently try to open it up. When you're hearing the complaints, boy, all of a sudden you're getting somewhere. You may not be there yet, but all of a sudden there's sort of this doorway that's opening, and maybe you can get more information.
Yeah. So what do you do, Curtis, if there's this big mishmash of stuff and you're like, well, I know there's a bunch of stuff in there that's not my fault. And also they may be trying to communicate some things that they feel hurt by. I mean, how do you sift through all of that?
Well, I've got a couple goals, I think. One you already pointed to, and that is I want to open up the conversation. I want to validate their feelings. I want to validate their emotions, because if they feel like I was playing favorites with the other kids, that really hurts. And while I don't think that's true, still it's their reality. Yeah. And validating them is something like, wow, you know, when you're a kid, even an adult, and the parents are playing favorites, that is so hard. That is devastating. That feels terrible. Anybody feels that when that happens to them. That's validating the emotion, but it's not saying it's true or untrue.
Right. Right. So there's some validation, maybe just asking some deeper questions, even just the openness to hearing them out around those kinds of issues can be very freeing and help the young adult come to a different place of perspective, and giving them the freedom and the space to talk about it in a way where they feel like they're being heard.
Right. And arguing, rebutting the facts, that's not going to keep the conversation going. It's not the time, you know, sorting out all the problems. You don't do it all at once. You're going to open up the conversation first. Now, at the same time, though, if somebody's unloading on you, and you know what, I mean, if somebody's yelling at you or abusing you, you don't have to stay in a conversation that's being had at your expense.
Right.
You can insist on a time and place that's dignified and thoughtful and this sort of thing. So we're making the assumption that you're in a conversation, but it's starting to get to be too much. The other party's putting a lot of things on you where you realize this really isn't my responsibility. The fact that I said something to your sister and your sister went off and started drinking or something, that's not my fault how she responds.
Yeah, and I think it could take a number of conversations to sift through all of that. And I think we deserve to take the freedom to say, wow, this is a lot that you're saying, and I'm really going to have to think through it and ponder what you're sharing with me, and then have another conversation with you. And somehow I think in those numerous conversations, there's going to be places for apologies as you come to appreciate what you may have done, intentionally or not, to contribute to the harm. And there's probably going to be places where it's totally appropriate to say, I don't think that it's fair to blame me for XYZ. I'm not responsible for that. And so yeah, totally, the apology is going to fit within a different kind of relational reconciliation process.
Wow, Karen, you're in those sensitive situations. It could be really hard to apologize, or sometimes I really know I've stepped in it and
Yeah.
I don't want to face up to the circumstances. So I can really resist apologizing. What are some reasons people resist?
Well, it's incredibly vulnerable to apologize, and we're not really going to have a lot of control over how the other person is going to respond. And sometimes we feel like we're in a place of safety where it's okay. And other times we can feel like, gosh, I'm going to apologize and it's just going to explode. There's just going to be more of this to have to work through. And so we kind of want to protect ourselves from all of that explosion.
That's right. So the apology is, in this case, it's not a one-off situation. And it may open up a conversation that might not start off the way you want. And another thing I worry about is reopening old wounds. So if the situation seems to be doing okay, it's not the best, but it seems to be going away, then I really hesitate to bring it up again by making the apology.
So you think it's just going to make it worse?
Yeah, it's going to make it worse. I can dredge up the pain or reopen the conflict that maybe wasn't satisfactorily, wrapped up.
Right.
But at the end of the day, really, the apology is indeed it's about my integrity, my sense of justice, and giving the other person their due.
Also, I was reading recently that to really step in there and offer a good apology, it takes a lot of inner strength. Like, you really do have to have this sense of self-worth and also self-acceptance so that you can admit to something without feeling like you're really undermining yourself. So, for example, I think people with perfectionism can have a really hard time apologizing because to them, admitting mistakes is connected with being unworthy as a person. And so it's hard to separate those things and feel like they can offer an apology without it really undermining their sense of self-worth. And if you have a lot of shame, for example, it's going to be very hard to enter into that process without being just overwhelmed by it.
It means a lot to the perfectionist to open up in that way. Another thing about apologies, sometimes I worry that I'm going to be manipulated.
Yeah, totally.
Or that once I put it out there on the table, then it's easier for the other person to hold it over my head. Sure. Oh, you remember that, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it'll be used against you.
Yeah, used against me.
It'll be weaponized even depending on the person. You're actually making me think of some situations where I know I hesitated because I felt like it was just going to be never ending if I apologized.
Karen, I'm sorry, but we're going to wrap this up.
Oh, we're out of time.
Do you have any parting comments?
I think it would just be to offer an encouragement that these are very uncomfortable situations, and getting good at apologies is a skill. I would just encourage people to kind of persevere in the uncomfortability because the wins you get from doing this well are really great.
Absolutely. If you are wondering if coaching is the right move for you, if you're curious, you should get in touch with us and we'll have a free consultation and discuss about how this might fit in, how we might be able to work together. Send us an email at thecatholicmidlife@gmail.com. Thanks a lot, you guys. See you next week. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Midlife podcast. It's great to be here with you. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite app or platform. Leave a review. That's so helpful so that others like you can find the podcast. And be sure to tell your friends. We'll see you next week.